I'm Keith Olbermann, and this is The Resistance. When I was a kid, my dad used to tell me of a dream he had again and again, starting in the late 50s. He was at his draftsman's desk, looking out his office window in Union Square in New York City, watching a perfect spring day, trotting towards its sunset, hearing the sounds of life and humanity through the open window and perceiving with his artist's eye the balance of the contrasting colors in the vivid sky and the city more vivid still beneath, and then noticing, out at the horizon, over the water, the mushroom cloud. It was a nightmare, but it was one rooted horrifically in a reality of nuclear annihilation, a nightmare that got just a little bit worse every day, and which, as he noted, you then had to pretend wasn't reality, and you had to pretend wasn't getting worse every day, and you had to pretend wasn't abnormal, and you had to pretend wasn't inhuman, and you had to pretend it wasn't unacceptable until you ended the day exhausted by the sheer amount of your life spent pretending that it was just fine. Better to find ways, small ones, symbolic ones, if possible financial ones, to fight back. You are spending just as much energy, he said. I was too young to share his nightmare, and he has gone too many years to share mine, but wise words stand the test of time, and his words were wise. At the pussy grabber in chief's victory party, a woman named Omarosa Manigault, who was briefly on television, said of people who did not vote for him, quote, "I would never judge anybody for exercising their right to and the freedom to choose who they want, but let me just tell you, Mr. Trump has a long memory, and we're keeping a list." We have to pretend that isn't abnormal. Then the chief of the campaign is named the chief strategist in the White House, and he has a track record a mile long of antipathy to women and black people, and all of a sudden you realize Ms. Manigault, who is both, is herself pretending that he isn't abnormal and she isn't a target. And then we get half a dozen different answers about whether or not the victor in the presidential election, who lost the popular vote, is going to shatter all precedent by fulfilling his campaign boast and become personally involved in the prosecution of the loser in that election. And all of a sudden, the media is pretending that this isn't abnormal. And last Sunday, the president-elect, who lost the popular vote, finally speaks about the Clintons and says, "I don't want to hurt them. I don't want to hurt them. They're good people." As if the decision whether or not to prosecute somebody in this country is to be decided about how the president personally feels about them. And now we all have to pretend that this isn't abnormal. Then the outgoing minority leader of the Senate, Harry Reid, actually doesn't pretend. And he says the election, quote, has emboldened the forces of hate and bigotry in America and is being celebrated by white nationalists, Putin, and ISIS, quote, while innocent, law-abiding Americans are racked with fear. To which the campaign manager of the Banana Republicans, Kellyanne Conway, replies, he should be very careful about characterizing somebody in a legal sense. He thinks he's just being some kind of political pundit here, but I would say be very careful about the way you characterize it. And then Ms. Conway pretends she wasn't referring to a lawsuit, even though she used the phrase legal sense, which I guess necessarily means she was thus referring not to a lawsuit, but to a prosecution. And once again, we must pretend this isn't abnormal. And the CNN headline after it actually reads, Conway-Reid trade barbs over Trump, as if criticism and threats against the First Amendment are somehow equivalent, and the pretending escalates. And it is reported that the transition team allegedly asked the White House how the children of this man could receive top-secret security clearance, the children who are supposed to be running the anything but blind business trust that we have to pretend is a real blind business trust, a trust for the man who we have to pretend did not spend the campaign accusing his opponent of mishandling classified information. And then the radio conspiracy peddler, Alex Jones, announces Trump has phoned to thank him and to promise to be on his show soon. And now we have to pretend Alex Jones hasn't claimed that the massacre at Sandy Hook was staged. And we have to pretend that he isn't crazy. And we have to pretend that it's not abnormal for a man elected president of the United States to even acknowledge that an Alex Jones exists, let alone to feed his machine of madness and brutality. And then the cabinet names start falling, and we have to pretend Giuliani isn't an international political whore who hasn't taken money from repressive elements everywhere from Qatar to El Salvador, and who's now consulting Uber. But of course, they all have to pretend as well. They have to pretend that there aren't still avenues open to us for economic blowback. Giuliani, Uber, stop using Uber. Alex Jones, That creature is on 100 radio stations. Google them. Call them up. Identify their advertisers. Boycott their advertisers. The ludicrous media equivalencies and the euphemisms that normalize hate and enable pretending. Don't tweet, don't call the writer, don't call the editor. Call the president of news or his boss at his corporation. I promise you from personal experience, they always overreact. Trump's hidden tax returns and the first for-profit presidency. How many Trump businesses can you avoid? How many firms that applauded his election, like New Balance, can you make go bankrupt? Just this week, the owners and residents of 3 New York apartment buildings got the names of their places changed. They are now 140 Riverside Drive, 160 Riverside Drive, and 180 Riverside Drive. They were Trump Place. These are the kinds of protests against pretending that we can make, and the kind that will hit the ego-elect the hardest. That, and forever referring to the fact that he lost the popular vote. And then we gear up for the biggest fight against pretending of our lives. That man, elected by a minority of voters, says he will immediately incarcerate or deport 2 to 3 million undocumented Americans, which is roughly the same number of people who live in Houston, Texas, which is roughly the same number of people who are already in all of the federal prisons and all the state prisons and all the county jails and all the city jails and all the ICE detention facilities and all the Navy brigs and all the Army stockades and all the military disciplinary barracks, all of them combined, which leaves no inference possible except that he somehow means to take 2 to 3 million people off our streets and keep them somewhere until they can be jailed or deported, and that we again have to pretend that this somewhere, for a population roughly the same size as all the prisoners in all the jails in this country right now, we have to pretend that this will not involve concentration camps. But don't worry, he's unifying the nation. Kellyanne Conway said so. Go back to pretending. This isn't getting worse every day. This isn't abnormal. This isn't inhuman. This isn't unacceptable. Resist. Peace.